begin transmission. Yesterday we were exploring this little sandy riverbank out by the rainforest, and we stumbled upon this little creature kind of half buried in the mud, and we scooped him out, and it was this almost balloon-like animal with 4 stubby legs, and it appeared to get pretty irritated with us, and we maybe poked it a little bit, but it inflated itself even more than it already was, and let out this spectacular squeak that we got on video. So check out this what we're calling a rain frog. Is it? Isn't that fantastic? What a remarkable creature. Not especially intimidating, although I think what it's trying to do is intimidate us. So they apparently, whenever they're scared of a predator, they will inflate themselves with air to make them look bigger and maybe make it more difficult to swallow them if you're a snake or something. And then if you get too close, then they emit this high-pitched, shrill scream, which for us is just funny, but maybe is scary if you're a frog predator. So the rain frog is the first one I wanted to tell you about. The second one is called the hairy frog. And the hairy frog is named the hairy frog because it has a bunch of little hair-like projections coming out of its side that it uses to breathe while underwater. But more remarkable than that is how the hairy frog defends itself. It has special bones in its feet, and when it is very upset, it will actually break these bones in its paws, in its feet, little legs, hands, things, and the bones will then protrude from the webbing, and then you have little bone claws that it will then smash you with and try to scratch and claw at you with. Really remarkable. So we call this frog the wolverine frog, and in addition to its other name, the hairy frog. But we call it the wolverine frog after the famous early president of the first American Republic, Martin the Wolverine Van Buren. We have one of the ancient historical archive pictures of what this president looked like. He had these massive retractable claws that he would whip out and slash opponents during heated congressional debates. So after this famous Martin Van Buren president, the Wolverine, we have named this intimidating bone claw frog. Today we'll be talking about frogs, some more frogs, some other frogs, and also toads, salamanders, and caecilians. As you can see, amphibians are very wise and thoughtful creatures. This is Walter. He's a green tree frog, and he is always available if you want to come to him with your problems, and he will sit patiently and listen, offer some very astute advice. So keep that in mind if you're struggling with really anything. He's a great listener and very wise, as a lot of amphibians are. They just have great, adorable little faces. So today we'll talk about frogs and toads and salamanders, or as some people like to call them, salamanders and caecilians. To begin, we kind of need to know where these guys are coming from. So we've been talking about fish, and you know by now that fish as a group is paraphyletic because it is from fish that the tetrapod lineage emerges. So tetrapods are 4-limbed, generally terrestrial animals, including our amphibians today, but also the amniotes, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. So the root of this is found in the Sarcopterygii, animals similar to coelacanth. And then emerging from that, according to evolutionary thinking, is this lineage right here, the Amphibia. And this is going to include our 3 major amphibian lineages. Now there are some really interesting ones that we don't really have time to talk about. The Lepospondyli and the Eusthenopterans and all those cool guys there. But I want to point out this one here, the Ichthyostega, because a while ago we talked about kind of interpreting the fossil record differently depending on your perspective on creation or evolution, and how an evolutionist is going to see all these fossils and these rock layers as being very slowly accumulated evidence of a very ancient Earth. And so these animals represent basically snapshots through time. So Ichthyostega lived a long, long time ago. much, and then Sarcopterygians lived even further ago than that. And then contrast that with a creationist who's going to see the same fossils and the same rock layers, but they're not going to attribute that to a long age. They're going to rather see this progression of time, not as time, but as ecology. So for an evolutionist, this animal right here, Ichthyostega, represents an evolutionary intermediate between fully aquatic fish and fully terrestrial reptiles and their relatives there. For a creationist, Ichthyostega represents an ecological intermediate between fully aquatic fish and fully terrestrial reptiles and their relatives. So this is, depending on your perspective, this fossil, this very interesting organism can be either interpreted as an evolutionary intermediate or as an ecological intermediate. And what makes it so unique and adapted for its intermediate lifestyle is that it has a rays on its fin-like tail, just like a fish. It has gills and a bony opercula that protects them. It has webbed feet, but it has a strong pelvic and pectoral girdle, sturdy limbs that can raise itself up off the floor of the water. And it has nostrils and a pretty substantial head. And so this is, it has features of both aquatic life and terrestrial life. And so it makes sense to interpret this as an evolutionary intermediate, as life was evolving from Sarcopterygian ancestors to tetrapod ancestors, or as an ecological intermediate, as the flood destroyed ecosystem after ecosystem, as the waters came up over the earth, from the marine and aquatic life down then to the intermediate swampy marshy life, and then the fully terrestrial life later on. So ecological versus evolutionary intermediate, but you should know that tetrapods are, according to conventional thinking, evolved from Sarcopterygian-like ancestors. And Ichthyostega is an example of that. What is so unique about terrestrial habitats? Well, there are 4 kind of challenges to living on land as opposed to water. The first is, I say challenges, but some of them are actually benefits, like oxygen content. Oxygen is a whole lot easier to get from air than it is in the water. It's about 20 times more abundant, and so it's actually much easier to get oxygen in the air than it is in the water. At the same time, oxygen diffuses more readily across a moist membrane than a dry one, and so even in terrestrial organisms, there's going to have some type of moist, wet facilitation of the gas exchange. So whether that's internally in a human lung or externally on the skin of a salamander, is still going to require some level of moisture to have the oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse across. Air is a lot less dense than water, which is quite intuitive, but what this means is that it's also more difficult to hold your body up. Water supports your body weight, and you don't have to fight against gravity quite so much when you have the water density supporting you. On air, you need that strong, sturdy limbs and a nice skeletal system to support your prodigious weight on land instead of just being flattened by the power of gravity. Temperature in water, water also acts as a fantastic insulator, and so temperature doesn't really vary in aquatic circumstances very much. In freshwater, it does as the seasons change, but in the marine environment, temperature is not very different. There are, of course, warm and cold places, but compared to terrestrial ecosystems, where temperature can change 40 degrees in a single day in a single place, it's nowhere near that level of dynamic change. There is also an abundance of habitat diversity in terrestrial ecosystems as opposed to aquatic ecosystems. Even a simple log like this offers a whole host of microhabitats underneath, inside, on, for a whole vast array of animals. And so there's a whole lot of new ecosystems to colonize in terrestrial habitats, and when a new ecosystem is colonized, that leads to diversification of life forms. And so we see rapid diversification on land as these animals fill these micro niches. Amphibians are kind of the bridge group between terrestrial and aquatic organisms, and that can be ecological or evolutionary. But they are ectothermic, which we haven't really talked about in depth, but ectothermic just means that the external environment influences their internal temperature, so they don't really generate very much of their own body heat. They need external sources of heat to keep active. Adults are usually terrestrial, but eggs and immatures are usually aquatic, and you can see here that the eggs are kind of gelatinous, fluid-filled sacs. They're not really shelled with either a hard shell or a leathery shell, and so the animals are still tied to the water. They must return to the water to mate and lay eggs in most species, even though the adults predominantly live on land. Living on land, they're also going to have special sensory organs that are going to be different than the aquatic sensory organs that we've been talking about. So a lot of the immature forms still have a lateral line system for detecting subfrequency vibrations underwater, but the adults generally lack that lateral line system. The adult's eyesight is going to be really important, and smell is going to be really important. And for smell, amphibians have a well-developed olfactory epithelium inside their little nostrils. And so chemical cues, smelling, is pretty common among almost all life forms. But until now, this is primarily external. So think about antennae on insects, or palps, or sensory hairs on legs, or tarsi, little feet. Most tasting is kind of external. But in smelling, with vertebrates, with terrestrial vertebrates, it's going to happen inside the nose. And part of that is because it can be moist, kept moist, and like I was saying earlier, chemicals adhere better when there's a moist environment. So olfactory epithelium, ectothermic, terrestrial aquatic animals, these are amphibians. There are 3 orders within class Amphibia. And just a reminder, we are in phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. So this is class Amphibia. And there are 3 orders here. The Gymnophiones, which are caecilians, order Uridella, which are the salamanders, and order Anura, which are the frogs and toads. And we'll just talk about each one in turn, beginning with these creatures here, the caecilians, in order Gymnophiona. One of my favorite snack foods is gummy worms, and so this creature looks quite delicious to me. But I wouldn't want to eat it because it's not gummy on the inside. It's bloody and skeleton-y. But anyway, the caecilians are strange-looking creatures. They're burrowers, and as burrowers, they're going to have specific adaptations for burrowing. You're going to see no limbs, so even though they have a pelvic and pectoral girdles, they are limbless. They have elongated rib cages, and so very similar to snakes. We'll talk about snakes later, but a lot of the similarities are pretty evident. They also are generally blind and often don't even have any eyes. This one you can see a little eye there, but you can tell it's not very astute. So seeing is not very important. However, sensing vibrations under the earth is going to be very important for them, and they have a pretty good sense of smell as well. So they burrow. They have a hardened kind of plate-like head that's blunted for facilitating burrowing. And how do you tell the difference between a caecilian and an earthworm? Well, here is both pictured, and the main difference is that caecilians belong to infraphylum Gnathostomata, which means they have jaws. Earthworms do not have jaws. So here you can see a caecilian trying to eat an earthworm. It's quite ambitious, right? There's no way he's going to eat that gigantic earthworm. But caecilians do prey on earthworms and other insects, not other insects, but they eat earthworms and insect larvae, and they have jaws. So if you discover a burrowing, limbless animal, you can check for a backbone. You can also check for jaws, and you can check for other attributes of annelids, like their internal septa or something. So it should be pretty easy to distinguish these two creatures. Eventually, we'll also need to distinguish legless snakes and legless lizards from caecilians as well. So to do that, think about their skin. The skin of caecilians is quite moist to facilitate cutaneous respiration. Caecilians reproduce, there's internal fertilization, and then usually the female will lay a cluster of eggs in a moist place and then guard them and protect them until they hatch into little baby caecilians. And caecilians are also quite intelligent. They're quick on their feet, and so one of the most common ways that they kill their prey is to attack them with clever retorts. And so you should never engage in a battle of wits with a caecilian if death is on the line. In Urodela, we have the salamanders, and salamanders are limbed. Obviously, they have 4 limbs, unlike the caecilians, but they still have that moist skin, and they're still primarily predators. And they like to eat grubs. And here you can see one snatching it up pretty quickly. Watch the way it swallows is pretty fascinating to me. So it's a very quick bite, and then to get this, there's not a lot of chewing in the mouth. They're going to swallow their food mostly whole. But to get the food down, they swallow kind of their eyes, and their eyes are going to push back down through the top of their mouth and help swallow. And I just think it's interesting because when humans try to swallow something that's maybe too big or gross or something, and we don't really want to do it, what do? We scrunch up our eyes and swallow. So it's kind of the same reflexive action. Reproduction in salamanders is also internal. They have internal fertilization, but the males don't deliver sperm straight to the females. Rather, there's a little mating dance that they do, and the males secrete a spermatophore and put it on the ground or on a twig or something, and then they kind of they grip the female by the arms and kind of do a little dance until she is over the spermatophore, and then she collects the spermatophore into her vent. The vent is essentially just the cloaca of salamanders, so common reproductive and waste excretion port. So the vent is kind of the cloaca of the salamanders, and so once the female retains the spermatophore into her vent, she will the eggs will be fertilized, and then she'll make a little burrow, maybe under a log or sometimes in water, and deposit the eggs there. Here you can see a little gelatinous blob, and the gelatin kind of protects the eggs from predators. It doesn't taste very good, FYI. Some species are viviparous, and the mother will incubate a whole little batch of younglings inside her uterus and then give birth to live young, and this is called direct development. So there is some kind of parental care in most species of salamanders, whether they lay eggs and then protect them or keep the eggs inside for protection and then give birth to live little teensy-weensy cute little salamander babies. There is a whole diversity of lifestyles in salamanders, and it can be kind of quite complicated. So just generally, their general life cycle is aquatic eggs, aquatic larvae, terrestrial adults, terrestrial mating, aquatic eggs, so on and so forth. So the larval stages, being aquatic, are going to have aquatic characteristics. They're going to have gills and a fin-like tail. And then the adults are going to have lungs and not fin-like tail. What paedomorphosis is retention of larval characteristics into the adult form. So usually there's some type of metamorphosis as the larvae transition into adulthood, but in specific species like the axolotl we talked about, and mud puppies and a whole host of others, the adults retain larval characteristics, and most of these are then still aquatic, obviously. So paedomorphosis is retention of larval characteristics into the adult body. In some species, the life cycle gets even more complicated because, as I said, you have aquatic eggs and then aquatic larvae and then terrestrial adults. Well, in these guys, the fire-bellied newts, they will actually revert back to larval forms, or not larval forms, but aquatic characteristics in order to mate. So they mate underwater and lay eggs, and then as juvenile adults, they're terrestrial. So there's a whole host of different kind of lifestyles. Some are completely terrestrial, some are completely aquatic, and some kind of go back and forth. Some are facultatively terrestrial. So you have some species that live in ephemeral pools, and most of the time they're completely aquatic, but when that pool dries up, their body transforms into a terrestrial type, and they can scamper over to the next pool over. Really phenomenal developmental biology. This is a close-up of a axolotl's gills, and you can see it's feathery, lots of surface area, lots of vascularized tissue, and this is going to be good for gas exchange. So as aquatics, they're going to breathe through gills. As terrestrials, they're going to breathe through their skin. This is called cutaneous respiration. And so their skin is kept moist and highly vascularized, and so they can actually breathe directly through their skin. Some species have lungs with which they breathe as well, and then some species support all this breathing with buccal respiration. Buccal means cheeks, and so they can actually absorb oxygen directly through their cheeks or mouth cavity, essentially. So they'll take in air, as you see this little salamander doing. So lots of different ways to get oxygen, from gills to the skin to the mouth to lungs, and it varies depending on the species and the habitat. In frogs, so frogs, I'm going to contrast frogs versus toads, and I should mention that the Urodela, the salamanders, have tails, and the anurans are without tails. So these are the frogs and toads. In adult forms, they don't have tails. Frogs and toads are primarily predaceous, like most of the amphibians are. There's not a firm distinction between frogs and toads, but frogs tend to be kind of greener and wetter and spend most of their time in or near water. There are some gigantic frogs, like this great horned frog, which are big enough to eat small vertebrates. And there are some little tiny frogs that are smaller than this little ancient dime that you see here. So the size is highly variable, but they tend to still be somewhat aquatic, or at least require moist environments to live and breathe and breed. Contrast that with toads. Toads are usually, broadly speaking, right, there's not a classification difference here, generally speaking, but toads usually have thicker, more waterproof skin, and so these are the ones that can inhabit some deserts. And so toads are able to exploit habitats that frogs can't because of their moist skin. Toads also are kind of warty. They're covered in little bumps and bulges, and a lot of this is camouflage, but there's two particularly large warts right behind their eyes called the parotid glands, and this secretes a toxic chemical for defense. And so toads, generally warty, bumpy, can exploit drier habitats and defend themselves with parotid glands. Both frogs and toads live in terrestrial environments, though, that are seasonal, and so they need to survive all kinds of different temperature changes during the winter and summer months. And to do this, they often will hibernate for certain periods of time. So this fantastic looking creature is the purple frog, and the purple frog only comes out to breed once a year during the peak of the rainy season. The rest of the time it is dug underground and undergoes a deep sleep hibernation until the next rains come around. So it's a very short life as far as their awake time goes, because they only come out for a few weeks to breed. But when they are all out, there is this massive population burrowing up from the ground. And they're just unusual looking animals. So one way to survive temperature changes is to just go into dormancy when temperature is such that you don't like it. That's the general strategy, actually. There are some anurans that can live quite far north, and where the temperature is at or below freezing during a majority of the year. And to survive freezing during the fall, they will prepare a fat body, so they'll store a whole lot of extra triglycerides in a special organ called the fat body. And then they're also start making glycerol, which is an alcohol that will prevent ice crystal formation in their cells during freezing. So there are actually some frogs that can be totally frozen solid, and they won't, then they can be thawed and they're perfectly fine. So this glycerol and glucose that they sequester helps prevent their cells from being destroyed during the rethaw process. This is a poison dart frog, and a lot of brightly colored frogs are going to defend themselves with toxin. We saw the parotid gland in the toad for this similar idea. So a lot of them are toxic. A lot of them also are really good jumpers. That's kind of one thing they're known for, is their jumping ability. So jumping first, if not, then they can be toxic. This is a reminder of our friend the rain frog, which blows itself up to maybe look intimidating or to at least be difficult for a snake to swallow. And that's one way to defend yourself. Also, you could just never be discovered. So right here we have a camouflaged tree frog that looks just like the bark it's sitting on. If you can see that one. Can you find the frog in this picture? And yes, there is an actual frog in this picture. It's just incredibly well camouflaged. Most people cannot find it, but I will point it out to you. It is right here, and even after I point it out, it's hard to see, but this is its face, this is its nose, this is its right hind leg. You can see the bend of its knee. This is its other hind leg. And so this is just a beautifully camouflaged leaf frog that is very difficult to even spot even if you know where it is. So camouflage, toxins, puffing up with air, jumping, they're pretty good at defending themselves. During the reproductive season, you will most likely hear a tremendous chorus of chirps and squeaks and pipes and shrills and calls. This is the males typically will use inflated vocal sacs to make a whole host of different sounds to call females to them and to actually stake out their territory with competing males. And so you can see here the bulging vocal sacs of the male frog. Once the female finds the male will jump on her back and clasp really, really, really tightly under her arms, and this is called amplexus. And he will stay like this for a very, very long time and prevent other males from, and other males, if they find the female, will try to shove him away and kind of insert themselves in between them so that they can fertilize her eggs. So this is a pretty unique style of reproduction where the male will stay with the female for a long period of time and guard her, protect her from other males. Eventually the female will release eggs, and then the male releases sperm on top of them. So this is external fertilization, not internal, as we see in salamanders and caecilians. Eggs are almost always laid in water or near water, and where they gelatinize and form these masses of eggs. And then these little eggs develop into tadpoles, which are very different than the adults. The adults are almost always predatory. Tadpoles are almost always herbivorous, and they're just basically a little blob with a massive tail. And as they grow and mature, the tail gets shorter and they sprout little legs, and eventually, if all goes right, they will transform into adults. And this is just remarkable to me, how the same animal can be this animal and then a frog. It's the developmental biology and the plasticity of the genome to produce all these different life forms is really one of the most phenomenal things in nature to me. Once they have children, oftentimes frogs make pretty good parents. In the toxic poison dart frogs, often the tadpoles will crawl up onto the backs of the parents for protection for a while. Otherwise, there is the marsupial frog, which keeps its eggs in a special pouch on its back. You can see the bulges there. Another unusual method is the gastric brooding frog, and this frog eats its eggs and then keeps the developing little froglets in its stomach. So the gastric brooding frog actually holds its young in its stomach. This is a fantastic species because, as you know, stomachs are kind of made for destroying life things. They're made for disintegrating things. So to survive in the acid, the hydrochloric acid of the stomach, these frogs secrete a really awesome anti-acid to protect them. And so this can be used for human ulcers, to prevent stomach ulcers from forming, which is essentially when the stomach acid starts eating away at your stomach lining itself. So the gastric brooding frog keeps frogs in their stomach. You also have this frog here. The males will keep their little young frogs, little tadpoles, in their mouth. So backs, mouths, stomachs, just everywhere. And then the Suriname toad, during reproduction, the males and females do a little backflip, and the eggs get kind of pressed into a special spongy back of the female, which kind of grows around them, and then they develop into little frogs, and then all emerge from her back, which is just a little creepy and gross. And then she can do it again the next year. So lots of different ways to protect the young, and fantastic developmental plasticity. Everything's been pretty quiet for us since the trial yesterday, and so there hasn't been much action to report. We've all gotten back to our normal lives. And Josh, yeah, did you have a question? Oh yeah, so about SADS, yeah, sudden onset acute stasis sickness. Yeah, what's your question? Yeah. That is a good question, and I appreciate you asking it, because why would all these humans volunteer for a mission like this if they almost knew 100% sure, 90% within 10 years they were going to die from this horrible brain deteriorating disease? You guys are all candidates for this mission, so you guys are very well aware of this history already, but for Josh and Alfredo, it bears repeating. So on Earth, the situation is like this. A long time ago, in the year about 5 centuries ago, we'll say, humans invented pretty robust artificial intelligence that quickly became smarter than the average human. And as these androids developed more and more intelligence and capabilities, they surpassed humans in almost every area. So they became smarter and faster and better at problem solving, and this made a lot of humans uncomfortable, because for centuries there had been rumors of a upcoming robot apocalypse that all the humans were worried about. And it turned out to be a lot less apocalyptic and more just kind of the androids just were better. And so what happened during the first and second android wars was kind of trying to figure out where society ended with having this population of super advanced androids and then also humans. Now humans weren't destroyed. The androids are quite benevolent. So the humans they're not subservient. They're not slaves to the androids. But all the important positions in society are manned by androids, because why would you want someone who's dumber and slower and can't think quick in positions of importance? So humans aren't really slaves on Earth, and they're not really pets. The androids keep them around because they like them, and they think it's wrong to kill them. I guess the best analogy would be that humans are just kind of superfluous children. They are considered valuable by androids, and so they're not destroyed, but they're taken care of. All their needs are provided for, but the humans pretty much just wander around getting into trouble and crying a lot. And so part of the impetus for this mission is to find a new planet for the humans to inhabit. The androids are happy with Earth. They don't really see the need to expand. They went to Mars, and that was great, but now what? So the androids are kind of doing their own thing. This is really a mission for humans, because, and the androids support it, because it would be great for their little children to prosper again, to get a second chance on a new Earth-like planet. And so all of these missions have had a few androids on board, but most of them are humans. And the humans know that there's a great risk in undertaking this mission. They know they're going to get SADs and die, but the idea is that hopefully, 19th mission, this one is spectacularly successful, and now maybe humans have a place to come. But it took us 51 years to get here. All the humans on this crew will die, so that's why the androids came along, so that there can at least be one continuous presence preparing the place for future humans. And so that's why humans come, and that's why 2 members of the crew are androids. 2 members of each of the 19 crews have been androids. And so it's certainly a tragedy what's happened with Dr. Mastronomer and Dr. Cordyceres. This is a dangerous mission, and you guys, as you guys think about this is of such importance that you have volunteered to travel and risking potential death by SADs to give humanity a new, fresh start on a new planet. So it's important to think about what we're going to do with this potential gift.